From 2018 to 2020, the American public was mesmerized by a grand political theater. Donald Trump's trade war dominated every headline, with tariffs slapped on hundreds of billions of Chinese goods. Politicians from both sides of the aisle promised to stand up to Beijing and bring manufacturing back to the heartland. But behind that curtain of patriotic rhetoric, a silent and massive migration was occurring. While you watched the news, BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs were quietly moving $1.4 trillion into Chinese capital markets. This was not a lapse in judgment. It was the precise execution of a historical pattern that has repeated for over 300 years. History is not a series of random events. It is a mechanical script written in credit and debt. We saw this pattern unfold in 1794 as British capital began its quiet migration to the young United States before the pound's dominance faded. We saw it in 1923 during the Weimar hyperinflation. We saw it again in 1971 when the dollar's link to gold was permanently severed. Every major civilization that reached this threshold collapsed in exactly the same way. Today, the indicators are flashing red. The United States national debt has reached a mathematically impossible $36 trillion. When interest on debt consumes more than the entire defense budget, the system enters stage 3, overextension. Wall Street is not moving to China because they like the regime. They are moving because the math of the dollar-based system no longer works. They are repositioning your pension funds and savings through calculated index mandates like the MSCI before the inevitable reset occurs. In this video, I will decode the 4-stage cycle of empire collapse. I will prove why this migration of wealth is the most predictable move in financial history, and I will show you exactly where we stand in this pattern before stage 4 arrives to wipe out the unprepared. Most people believe money is a reward for labor or a store of value. They are wrong. In the eyes of the financial architects, money is nothing more than a meticulously designed energy extraction device. To understand why $1.4 trillion is migrating to the east, you must first accept a disturbing reality. The United States dollar is not an asset. It is a unit of debt. When the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, it stripped the American people of their monetary sovereignty and replaced it with a permanent rent on existence. Here is the cold math that confirms the trap. When the central bank issues $1 million into the economy, they do so as a loan. They create the principal, but they never create the money needed to pay the interest. This is a mathematical impossibility. If there are only $100 in existence, but you owe $105, where does the extra $5 come from? It can only come from more borrowing. This ensures that the total debt in the system will always, by design, exceed the total supply of money. This isn't a flaw in the machine. It is the machine's primary function. It creates a perpetual vacuum that pulls wealth upward from the middle class to the credit-issuing elite. However, every debt-based system has a terminal point, a moment where the interest payments become so massive that no amount of productivity can bridge the gap. We have reached that point in 2025, with interest payments now exceeding $1 trillion annually. The architects know the American experiment is reaching its mathematical conclusion. They are not trying to save the dollar. They are simply harvesting the final remnants of American wealth and moving the engine to a new host before the vacuum collapses. This is the blueprint of every collapsed empire in recorded history. It follows a 4-stage mechanism that is as predictable as the laws of physics, yet invisible to those blinded by political loyalty. Stage 1, the monopoly. A private central banking architecture is established to seize absolute control over the nation's currency supply. In 1913, the Federal Reserve became the master architect of the American dollar, ensuring that every unit of currency was birthed from a debt obligation. Stage 2, the expansion. The system floods the world with cheap credit, creating an illusion of infinite prosperity. This was the post-World War II era, where the dollar became the global reserve currency and American debt fueled global growth. Stage 3, the overextension. This is where the math begins to fail. The debt grows exponentially faster than the economy can produce tangible value. Inflation begins to hollow out the middle class, and the government is forced to borrow just to cover the interest on previous loans. Today, with the United States national debt at $36 trillion, we have reached the terminal point of stage 3. The engine is overheating, and the vacuum is starting to pull back. Stage 4, the repositioning. This is the final, most brutal phase. The financial architects realize the host nation is no longer a viable vessel for their wealth. They do not stay to fix the collapse. They facilitate it. They quietly move their capital to the next rising power center, while the public remains trapped in debased currency and rising taxes. This explains the $1.4 trillion migration to Beijing. It is not a betrayal of American values. It is the scheduled execution of Stage 4. They are moving the engine to a new host, leaving the American middle class to settle the final bill of a century-long debt experiment. To understand why $1.4 trillion is flowing to Beijing today, we must examine the original blueprint left by the architects of the British Empire. In 1694, the Bank of England was created not to serve the public, but to finance the Crown's endless wars. This was stage one, the monopoly. A private syndicate was granted the exclusive right to issue the nation's money as debt. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in 1815, the British national debt had exploded from a mere £1.2 million to a staggering £885 million. Despite this massive debt, the empire entered stage two, expansion. The British pound became the global reserve currency, and London became the undisputed financial center of the world. However, stage two eventually yields to the inevitable hubris of stage three, overextension. By the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire was fighting global conflicts that it could no longer mathematically afford. The interest on the debt began to consume the nation's productivity. Between 1914 and 1945, the pound was systematically debased to pay for imperial survival. The middle class watched their purchasing power vanish, yet the elite architects did not panic. Why? Because they had already initiated stage four, the repositioning. As early as the 1890s, the same financial institutions that controlled London began shifting their liquidity across the Atlantic. They financed American railroads, the steel industry, and the rise of the New York Stock Exchange. They were moving the lifeblood of the global system from an old, debt-choked host to a young, productive one, the United States. By the time the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 officially crowned the dollar as the new reserve king, the transition of real wealth had been completed decades prior. History is repeating with haunting precision. The $1.4 trillion migration of capital from Wall Street to China during a trade war is not a betrayal. It is the modern execution of stage four. The architects recognize that the American $36 trillion debt mountain has reached its terminal velocity. Just as they abandoned the pound for the dollar, they are now positioning themselves for the next transition. They are moving into the rising infrastructure of the East while leaving the American public to settle the accounts of a bankrupt system. The playbook remains identical. Only the names of the empires have changed. If you believe the transition of the British Empire was an isolated event, you are ignoring the mathematical physics of debt. History provides us with two brutal validations of Stage 3 and Stage 4, the Weimar Republic of 1923 and the Nixon shock of 1971. These were not accidents. They were deliberate executions designed to liquidate the middle class and preserve the power of the financial architects. Look at the Weimar Republic. Following World War I, Germany was buried under a debt mountain of 132 billion gold marks. It was a mathematical impossibility to repay. To solve this, the central bank initiated a hyperinflationary Stage 3. They didn't just print money, they destroyed the currency to zero out the government's internal debts. While ordinary Germans used wheelbarrows of paper marks to buy a single loaf of bread, the elite architects had already repositioned their wealth into foreign currencies and hard assets like gold and real estate. By the time the old mark was officially dead, the wealth transfer was complete. The population was left with worthless paper, while the architects emerged as the owners of the new German economy. Fast forward to August 15th, 1971. This was the moment the United States officially entered Stage 3 of the current cycle. President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This was the ultimate betrayal. It removed the last physical restraint on debt expansion. Since that day, the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power when measured against gold. The national debt has skyrocketed from less than $400 billion to the $36 trillion we see today. These two historical markers prove that when Stage 3 reaches its limit, the system does not fix itself. It resets. The architects do not try to save the currency. They harvest the remaining value and move to a new host. The silent migration of $1.4 trillion from Wall Street to China is simply the modern version of the Weimar elites moving to foreign gold or the 1971 architects preparing for a fiat world. They are following the math. They know that in a debt-based system, the only way to win is to exit the host before the final collapse of Stage 4 occurs. We are no longer speculating about the future. We are living through the final hours of Stage 3. As of 2025, the mathematical exhaustion of the United States financial system is undeniable. The national debt has surged past $36 trillion. To put that in perspective, the interest payments alone now exceed $1 trillion annually, surpassing the entire United States defense budget. This is the definition of Stage 3, overextension. When a nation borrows money just to pay the interest on previous debt, the vacuum of wealth extraction reaches its terminal velocity. But here is where the public is being deceived by the trade war narrative. You are told that Washington is decoupling from Beijing, yet the financial plumbing tells a different story. The $1.4 trillion that migrated to China was not primarily through foreign direct investment in factories. It was executed through portfolio flows, the silent movement of stocks and bonds. The architects at BlackRock and Vanguard did not need to ask for permission. They simply adjusted the weightings of the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. By increasing China's weight in these global indices, Wall Street forced trillions of dollars from passive American pension funds and 401k plans into Chinese assets. This was not a market accident, it was a structural mandate. While politicians shouted about tariffs on television, the financial architects were using your retirement savings to fund the infrastructure of the next host empire. They are harvesting the remaining liquidity of the American middle class to collateralize the rise of the East. Look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Look at the debasement of the dollar's purchasing power since 2020. The pattern is executing with forensic precision. We are currently at the precipice where Stage 3 ends and Stage 4, the total repositioning, begins. The $1.4 trillion was merely the first major wave of the great wealth transfer. The architects have already built the bridge. They are now waiting for the current host to finish its scheduled collapse. History confirms that Stage 4 is never a soft landing. It is a mathematical liquidation. When the financial architects have finished moving their capital, as evidenced by the $1.4 trillion migration to the east, they no longer have any incentive to maintain the stability of the old host. We are now approaching the transition from Stage 3's overextension to Stage 4's total reset. There are two primary scenarios for how this concludes, and neither favors the American middle class. The first scenario is managed hyperinflation. To wipe out $36 trillion in national debt, the Federal Reserve must systematically destroy the value of the currency. By printing money to cover interest payments, they dilute the purchasing power of every dollar you have worked for. In this scenario, the debt technically gets paid, but only because the dollar becomes worthless. Your savings are the fuel for this fire. The architects, however, remain untouched as they have already pivoted into hard assets and rising foreign markets. The second scenario is the controlled collapse and digital transition. This is the introduction of a new global reserve architecture, likely a digital currency system or a basket of assets, controlled by the same institutional architects who manage the dollar's decline. This transition requires a crisis of such magnitude that the public will beg for a new system. Whether it is a systemic bank failure or a debt default, the crisis serves as the reset button. The political theater you see today is designed to keep you looking at the stage while the architects finish moving the furniture out the back door. The $1.4 trillion was the first heavy crate to leave. When Stage 4 completes, the transition will be rapid. The dollar will not die slowly. It will be replaced overnight by a system that was pre-planned years in advance. The architects do not fear the crash. They designed the exit. In every Stage 4 transition, wealth is never truly destroyed. It is simply moved. You must understand a disturbing reality. You, the saver, the taxpayer, the hard-working American, are not the customer of this financial system. You are the liquidity. In this final hour of the American debt cycle, the great wealth transfer is already in motion, and the line between the winners and the losers is being drawn with mathematical precision. The losers are the many, the 99% who hold their wealth in the host nation's currency and debt-based instruments. If you have a savings account, a fixed income pension, or a traditional bond portfolio, you are currently being liquidated. Inflation is not an accidental byproduct of supply chains. It is the silent harvesting of your life's energy. As the dollar's purchasing power is systematically hollowed out to service $36 trillion in debt, your labor is being stolen to keep the machine breathing for just a few moments longer. The winners are the few. The institutional architects like BlackRock, Vanguard, and the global banking dynasties. Well, they do not fear the devaluation of the dollar because they do not hold dollars. They hold assets. Now, these are the entities that moved $1.4 trillion into the next host empire while the public was distracted by the theater of trade wars. By manipulating global indices like the MSCI, they have effectively used the collective wealth of American 401k plans and retirement funds to buy into the rising infrastructure of the East. Why does this system continue despite its obvious cruelty? Because the architects profit from the collapse. They earn management fees on the way up, and they buy your distressed assets for pennies on the dollar on the way down. They have designed a system where they win regardless of which empire sits on the throne. They are not loyal to the American flag. They are global managers of capital. Until you realize that this system is designed to feed on your ignorance, you will remain the source of liquidity for their next 300-year cycle. If you are waiting for the government or the financial architects to save the system, you have already lost. The math of $36 trillion in debt is a one-way street toward total currency debasement. Survival in Stage 4 requires you to stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like the architects themselves. When Wall Street moved $1.4 trillion, they were not speculating. They were positioning. They moved from a debt-saturated host toward assets with tangible value and structural growth. To protect yourself in 2025, you must diversify away from purely fiat-denominated assets. History shows that during every Stage 4 reset, the value of paper currency gravitates toward its intrinsic value, zero. The survivors of the British pound collapse or the Weimar hyperinflation were those who held what we call hard assets. Gold, silver, and productive land are not just investments. They are lifeboats. They are the only stores of value that cannot be printed out of existence by a central bank or deleted by a systemic bank failure. You must also recognize that political theater, the constant noise of partisan warfare, is designed to keep you emotionally anchored to a sinking ship. While the public argues over headlines, the elite are busy securing their exits. Positioning for the reset means reducing your exposure to the traditional banking system and moving toward physical or decentralized assets. The window of opportunity to transition from stage 3 to a position of safety is closing fast. The architects have already completed their migration. They have already moved their $1.4 trillion. It is time you built your own bridge before the math finally settles the score. The 4-stage cycle we have deconstructed is not a mere theory. It is the accounting software of human civilization. It is cold, mechanical, and indifferent to your political beliefs or national pride. From the central bank monopoly established in 1913 to the debt-fueled expansion of the 20th century, and now to the $36 trillion overextension of today, the sequence is complete. Wall Street's silent migration of $1.4 trillion is the final mathematical confirmation that Stage 4, the total repositioning, is currently executing behind the curtain of political theater. The architects of this system have already built their bridge to the next host empire. They are not waiting for a political savior to fix the dollar, and they are not interested in preserving the American middle class. They are simply following the flow of capital to where it is protected from the coming currency debasement. The pattern does not care about your hopes or your hard work. It only cares about the mathematical reality of debt that can no longer be serviced. You are now standing at the crossroads of history. You can continue to watch the headlines and remain the liquidity for the elite's exit, or you can recognize the pattern and position yourself for the reset. Stage 4 is not just approaching. It is here, and it is accelerating. Subscribe now to track the final completion of this cycle and learn how to protect your family's legacy from the inevitable collapse of this 100-year debt experiment. The pattern never lies, and in the end, time is the only asset you cannot print.